Hi everybody, tonight we're going to talk about calculation of real GDP and what it means. There are two sections tonight. Section one is what GDP tells us. The second is then within the context of real GDP, we're going to talk about how to calculate it, and we're going to talk about what real GDP doesn't measure in terms of overall economic performance. All right, let's get right into it. So what does GDP tell us? Well, as we talked today in class, GDP is the value of current production at current prices. So, for example, valuing 2009 production with 2009 prices creates GDP, but specifically it creates something called nominal GDP. It's also known as current dollar GDP or money GDP. What's the difference between that and real GDP? Well, here's why it's important, first of all, for us to know the difference. If prices rise and quantity stays the same, quantity of output, GDP will increase, right? Because GDP is basically quantity times prices. Well, that's misleading to say that GDP will increase because the true size of the economy hasn't increased. Remember, the size of the economy is quantity of output. And in this case, if prices go up and the quantity stays the same, what's happened is the economy hasn't increased, it's just gotten more expensive. So to adjust for changes, we use something called real GDP. What real GDP is effectively eliminates that impact of inflation or price increase to help us understand real changes over time. What real GDP does is calculates the value of current production using prices from a fixed point in time called the base year, usually a year that has already occurred. So, for example, valuing 2009 production at 2008 prices creates real GDP in 2009 and then allows us to compare it back to 2008, which is in this case the base year. This is also known as constant dollar GDP. If you think about this, this makes sense because we talk about GDP, we talk about changes, and we talk about, as we mentioned in class today, a GDP change, GDP growth of 2 to 3%. Well, it's 2 to 3% compared to what? It's 2 to 3% compared to, in most cases, the prior year. Let's use an example in how we calculate GDP and real GDP. In this case, we have a very simple economy. You only have two products that are being produced. One is apples and one is oranges. So in year one, which we're considering our base year, we have 2 billion apples at a quarter each. We have 1 billion oranges at 50 cents each. The GDP in billions of dollars is $1 billion using this times this plus this times this. Real GDP in using year one dollars, of course, is also 1 billion. Year two, let's take a look at this. We have 2,200 what would this be? 2.2 billion. So an increase. We also have a price that's increased from 25 cents to 30 cents. In oranges, we also increased the output of oranges from 1 billion to 1.2 billion. We went from 50 to 70 cents. So the GDP, nominal GDP, is going to be 1.5 billion, this times this, plus this times this, but we need to adjust to get to real GDP. So how do we do that? Well, let's look down here at the steps I've outlined. Step one in finding real GDP is to adjust year two sales using year one prices. So year two sales using year one prices. And that calculation, pause if you want to go through this, yields a GDP measure of 1.15 billion, not 1.5 billion, because prices increased. And we want to take a look at this output at last year's prices. So what happens? Well, step two, to compute a percentage change year one to year two to get a percent change in GDP, we take the adjusted year two minus year one over year one, and you get 15% change. And sorry, that should be 15%, not percent 15. Pause here so you can go through this math again to make sure it's clear. The book also looks at something called chain linking. What I want to let you know is that we need to understand the concept of chain linking, but just know this. It's a process of using the average between the GDPs of an early base year with GDP of a later base year, meaning this. We could take in 2009, we could take 2009 GDP and use real GDP versus nominal GDP for 09 using 05 dollars. We could also do it using 01 dollars. And what chain linking does is basically uses average GDPs over a course of different calculations. If you can understand that, we're in pretty good shape. We can talk about it more if it's not clear. Now let's talk about what real GDP doesn't measure. Well, short story is it doesn't measure happiness. We talked about today about increases in perceived prosperity. Let's make sure though that we don't connect prosperity and happiness. We may have more in terms of money and financial resources over time, but it doesn't mean we're necessarily happier. Well, what are the things that it doesn't measure for us in terms of happiness? Well, a lot of things that make people happy don't contribute to GDP. Volunteerism, so you taking your time to go do things for other people. Leisure, so you decide to hang out at the pool in the summertime rather than working. It may make you feel good, it may make you happier, but it's not going to impact GDP in a positive way. Work around the house. So if I mow my lawn, instead of hiring someone to mow my lawn, I'm actually making a negative impact on GDP because the dollars that I would have spent to the person who mowed my lawn would have been service dollars included in GDP, and instead I did the work myself. So now, flip side is some things that contribute to GDP don't necessarily make us happier. And keep in mind, happiness is a very subjective measure, but I think it's worth discussing anyway. So here's some things that contribute to GDP, don't necessarily make us happier. So spending money to put bars in your windows, does it make you happier? I'd argue it makes you feel safer, but it's not necessarily increasing your happiness. Cleaning up after a natural disaster, so Katrina or a snowstorm, both contribute to GDP because here there's probably building going on and investment in services, same here, but it's not necessarily making you happier, it's just keeping you from being sadder, we'll call it. And then spending money to fight preventable diseases, so things like emphysema. Well, I'm trying to fight these diseases not to make myself happier, to keep myself from getting less happy. So again, very subjective. One person's happiness may not be another person's happiness, but important for us to understand from an economic standpoint. So what did we talk about tonight? We talked about what GDP tells us. We talked about real GDP versus nominal GDP. We talked about how to calculate real GDP. Talked about also what real GDP doesn't measure. That's it. Have a great night, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.